So instead of limiting their choice, trying to find a different way to tell her not to do a certain thing.
I'm your host, Madhav Malhotra, and today I'm glad to be joined by Dr. Polymeros Chrysochou, a professor of marketing and consumer behavior in Denmark. He studies how people sometimes do the opposite of what we tell them, and how that influences nonprofits, governments, and companies trying to persuade us. I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today, because I'm very excited to dive into the science behind some of these experiments that you've been running. And before we dive into any of the technical details, what I'd absolutely love is just to hear, could you quickly introduce yourself and how you got started being interested in this line of research?
Yeah. Hello, my name is Polymeros Chrysochou. You can call me Paul. I work at Aarhus University in Denmark at the Department of Management. My research area is branding and marketing communications. Mainly, I'm curious to find answers to problems like sustainability, for instance, health eating, organic food consumption. And of course, one of these topics that we have been working on is about reactance, and especially with pro-environmental behaviors. And there's also another recent project that we actually published on cryptocurrency.
So now, when it comes to the layperson, they might not have heard of this term reactance. So could you quickly explain what psychological reactance theory is and, practical examples of how it affects us day to day?
Yeah. Well, reactance theory posits that sometimes people, when they're told to not to do something, they actually do the opposite. Take an example for small kids. I have a small 3-year-old daughter. I tell her not to watch TV. And the first thing she wants to do is just take the remote and open the TV and watch TV instead, right? So basically, it's human nature. When we restrict our freedom of choice, then what happens is there's a kind of a reactance mechanism inherent, right? And therefore, people react to this and they actually do the opposite that they are told not to do. You probably have personal experience. I have personal experience when I was told something not to do and actually did the opposite without even sometimes knowing that actually this is the right decision to make. I remember a few years back when there was general lockdown, people were asked to stay indoors, right? I come from Greece. And they were only allowed to go out for a walk, let's say for 5 minutes, half an hour, don't recall exactly how much time they were allowed to spend. And because simply people were told not to go out, all started suddenly exercising, walking the dogs out, like doing exactly the opposite of what they were told not to do. So this is the classic example of reactance theory. So we react to issues when we feel that we have a restriction of our freedom to choose. So we feel a certain threat, if you like, right?
That seems like a pretty good intro, and I definitely appreciate those real life examples that you put in. And we have an intuitive understanding of it, but then there's also the rigorous experiments that you've been doing. So could you describe some of these experiments, what you were hoping to achieve when you set them up?
Let's start with the pro-environmental behaviors. The issue here is to understand how people could enact in a pro-environmental way. For instance, recycling or returning batteries, right? Used batteries. What we actually started with is normative appeals. The normative appeals say what the majority of people do, and we basically, as humans again, do the behavior, right, that the majority does. That's part of the norms. You go outside in the street, for instance, and you realize that the majority drives on the left line, let's say, of the street, you will automatically drive on the left line on the street, even if, for instance, the rule says the opposite, right? Because you act in the way that the majority actually does. The way, though, that we did this study is it has to do with the communication. So what type of normative appeals in a descriptive or in an injunctive way? And when it comes to descriptive norms, basically it implies the messages used are more descriptive in nature and they tell us what the majority does. Okay, whereas the injunctive norms that we also test against the descriptive says what people think that we should be doing. So guess which of these two type of framing approaches, if you like, in the message, create more reactance?
When you tell people what they should be doing.
Exactly, right. Basically what people think you should be doing, right? So basically, this type of normative appeals elicit more reactance, which then obviously it drives away from the behavior. So basically, in all these studies that we carried out, we tried to understand which of these norms actually work better. Normative appeals work better in terms of communication, right? So basically, the main outcome or implication that stems out from this series of studies that we did was how we should be framing in communication. So we should be adopting more the descriptive norms, because we know that we expect that people will adopt more, or they're inclined to adopt more the pro-social behavior, pro-environmental behavior.
So just to make sure I understand here, would it be fair to say that, an example of a descriptive normative statement might be 50% of people in your neighborhood, they recycle their batteries? The injunctive normative statement might be 50% of your neighbors think you should be recycling batteries.
Exactly.
Could you tell me about the effect size? How much difference was there in people actually doing that?
I don't recall about effect sizes. I don't have them top of mind, but what we actually consistently find is that the descriptive norms elicit less freedom threat. And this is somehow the process that we revealed through the studies, right? So we think we can't argue, let's say, the message, and essentially we don't perform. Our intention at least to perform, because we don't measure actual behavior, we measure intentions, which is a proxy, let's say, of the expected behaviors are lower.
And then regarding your other experiments with the crypto regulations, could you tell me about some of the differences or,
This is an interesting area, by the way, right? Cryptocurrencies are an important topic nowadays, especially the last 5-10 years. How we did this study together with Brett Martin and Caroline Strong. Brett Martin is from Queensland University of Technology, and Caroline Strong is from Cardiff University in the UK. First of all, we look into reactance, but this time as threat reactance. What is the difference between this and the previous examples that I described? Is the one is temporal, right? So basically, upon exposure to a certain type of communication, you react, right? But at the same time, think like two kids. You say one kid, don't watch TV, and the other kid, you say the same, and one might react differently than the other, right? Because they're different personalities. So we try to capture this type of differences in reactance as a personality trait. And we see also that these are correlated with anger, which is an emotional reaction, right? You feel more angry. And at the same time, with a positive affect. So two opposite emotional reactions. But what we actually found in the study that both are positively correlated. But what we also did in this study is we confronted participants to different types of messages in relation to regulating cryptocurrencies. One is obviously there's no regulation. There should be, basically it should be free for people to decide how they should invest. That is more the freedom expression of cryptocurrencies, more or less today, right? But in some countries, there's already some kind of regulations. In Singapore, for instance, there is already some discussions going on. So we try to also expose a fraction of our participants to a message where there are discussions about governments basically setting some rules on who should be investing in cryptocurrencies. And obviously it limits the freedom of being able to invest in such assets. Although the key driver of the two messages is that the restriction, same message, creates more anger. It drives less positive affect, obviously, right? Because people want freedom, but we don't find anything to do in relation to having a threat of reactance.
Makes sense. And when you said positive affect, you're talking about emotions like happiness, enthusiasm,
Yes.
relaxation.
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's very cool to see how, this one psychological theory can have applications in such seemingly very different contexts. What do you think are some practical lessons that you might, give people on how they should frame their outreach to others?
Yeah, this is, when it comes in general to reactance theory, this is reverse psychology. So you have to take this as an advantage, right? So you really know that people react to certain types of framing or that type of communications and messages. So we need to understand how we can reduce this type of reactance to the direction of the behavior that policymakers, for instance, or companies, right, the ways to direct. Well, I'm not here to say which behavior is good or bad, obviously. Whether we should invest in cryptocurrency or not, or whether we should recycle or not. Obviously, there are people who have different beliefs. But in general, if we try to enforce a certain type of behavior, it is important to take into consideration how individuals may possibly react to these type of messages, how they would perceive the lack of freedom to choose, right, based on their own free will. But at the same time, we really need to understand sometimes what potentially could go wrong. From a scientific point of view, I would say this is also where I'm particularly also interested in. Why, for instance, you say people to do A and they do B, or not to do A and eventually they do A. So how can we prevent this from happening? Because this is not part of our strategy, right? Think about companies, for instance, we would like to create persuasive messages for buying a product, right? Or communicate social marketing campaigns that try to help people to improve their lives, right? To eat more healthy or to eat less fat, or things like that are important to become more sustainable. Because the reverse psychology is actually, you can say the opposite. So I could easily say my daughter, watch TV at night, right? And then she might not actually want to watch TV, but I will go outside and play. So instead of limiting their choice, trying to find a different way to tell her not to do a certain thing.
Makes sense. I guess I'm curious about your experience. You have found this theory. I'm sure that you have connections with different business leaders, nonprofits, etc. What's your experience been like trying to get them to adopt these findings?
It's hard to say because as like one part is the research that we do. And the second is the ecological validity of the findings, obviously, and how this could be applicable in real life. That is always a challenge. This is a challenge with every social science. It's not a clear answer I could give to this, right? Obviously, as I said, for instance, with the example with the pro-environmental behaviors, we know that norms work. We know that descriptive norms, in our context at least, are more effective. And one reason that we explain that they are more effective, because also injunctive norms can be more effective, but we try to explain why the descriptive norms are better, right? And we explain the mechanism. When it comes to these being applied, obviously the key lesson is descriptive norms should be more used. Some of the challenges we also find is that we base all these results in what the majority of the people actually do, which is easy to convince people to do what what is the norm. But what happens if the minority actually does the right thing? And how do we actually are able to enforce behavior that the minority does? And this is one of the future, at least, directions that we're trying to take in.
I think that would be a very cool experiment to run. So, what do you think are some of the most neglected areas or most problematic areas that need changing?
Yeah, as I mentioned, this is one of the areas that actually is quite interesting. For instance, what the minority does, and it is the right thing. In certain countries, it is about donation. In Denmark, where I live and work, there is a return system for plastic bottles, right? And there you have two options when you basically go and return your plastic bottles or glass bottles, right, to the store. And then you have the option either to take a receipt back or donate. The majority of the people, they take the receipt. And this is, let's say, a very small example, but that also could be expanded to other forms of behavior still when it comes to donation, right? You can name some of these type of behaviors that we know that very few people actually do, but it would be nice if we could convert more people to do. There's a lot of work with behavior economists, for instance, with nudging. That's easy, opt-in, opt-out type of strategies, but also there are many actually that talk about systemic changes, for instance, not only individual changes. So we have to combine both at the same time, but there's always a but. We always need to think about the individuals on whether we respect, let's say, the freedom of choice. So restricting the options is one way, but at the same time, we need to respect freedom, right? That is very important, at least. To the extent possible that we can live as a society in an organized way, we still need to think about this as social scientists. Communication is paramount, right? To help people understand, to help people adopt or reject a certain type of behavior. These days, the European Union is actually discussing a new plan, how to cut down on gas consumption, right? And they try to put probably some measures that restrict the freedom of people to choose. They're thinking about, for instance, not allowing people to drive on a weekend. The question here is if they decide how they would be able to tell this in a way that, first of all, they understand the drive and the motive behind, but at the same time, people react less. Because this is a very classic example. They would be told probably not to go out on a weekend, and suddenly everybody will start driving to their summer houses on a Sunday. That's the classic reactance mechanism.
Makes sense. These are very important case studies, and I'm very glad we have experts like you to figure out, what are the principles that we can find out so that we can create these strategies in all of these different areas. So I really appreciate you taking the time to, walk us from the basics to these practical considerations today.
Thank you, Marcel.